US President-elect Donald Trump has announced plans to impose 25% tariffs on all imports from Mexico and Canada when he returns to the White House in January. Trump blames America's near neighbours for doing too little to prevent the flow of migrants and drugs into the US. Trump has threatened to hit Chinese goods with a 10% tariff on top of existing levies. He campaigned on the use of tariffs to boost US industries, but economists have warned that American consumers would end up paying the price. Now, trade is just one of the issues Donald Trump has with China. DW's chief international editor Richard Walker takes a wider look now at what a Trump 2.0 presidency could mean for broader US-China relations.
Donald Trump is back, and he's promising a return to an America-first foreign policy. And that means taking on China. He's chosen two hawks for the big jobs on this: Marco Rubio for Secretary of State and Mike Waltz as National Security Advisor. Both see China as the historic threat to US power.
So what can we expect? Well, let's take a look at the two biggest issues: the military situation and the prospect of a trade war. Military first.
Xi Jinping is now well into his second decade in power. China is getting stronger and more aggressive. In the South China Sea, its Coast Guard has harassed vessels from the Philippines, and it's been threatening Taiwan with air and navy drills. Either of these flashpoints could start a war that drags in the US.
There is a risk, and a growing risk, of a use of force by China, either in the South China Sea or in the Taiwan Strait. We know from the US intelligence community that Xi Jinping has told his military that it must have the capabilities to take Taiwan by force in 2027.
Trump does not want that to happen while he's in charge.
He has said time and again that he's going to prevent wars from happening, and that wars wouldn't happen under his watch. That's where he criticized Joe Biden. I think that resonated with the American public.
So the US military will need to deter Xi Jinping from making moves on Taiwan or the Philippines.
And here the US has a problem, a really big problem. To explain that, let's take a look at a map.
On China's east coast, there's a little island just off Shanghai. This is where you find the Jiangnan shipyard, which is a dual-use civilian and military site. It recently launched China's newest aircraft carrier.
So what's the problem for the US? Well, this single shipyard has more capacity than all of the shipyards in the United States put together.
That's according to the CSIS think tank here in Washington. And of course, Jiangnan is not China's only shipyard. The CSIS references a leak from a US Navy briefing saying that China's overall shipbuilding capacity is 230 times greater than America's.
Yes, you heard that right, 230 times. The US can build 100,000 tons of ships, naval and civilian, every year. China can build 23 million. The US may have the edge in terms of quality in some areas, but on that front too, there's little doubt that China can catch up.
This is now Trump's problem, and he won't be able to fix it on his own.
Oh, it's a very, very serious problem. And the United States, in order to get this right, is going to have to also rely on Japanese and Korean allies who are ahead in shipbuilding. It's going to have to be a multi-alliance effort to get allied shipbuilding up to anywhere close to where China is.
Okay, hold that thought for a moment. Let's move on to that other big issue, trade.
Trump made imposing tariffs on Chinese imports a centerpiece of his election campaign.
Tariffs, 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 tariffs.
He did this before, unleashing a war on what he saw as unfair trade with China that he never got to finish.
This time there's a danger that he'll have to reckon with, not coming from China, but from Europe.
Trump also clashed with European leaders over trade in his first term, and he's threatening to hit them with tariffs again.
The risk here is that Trump could start trade wars with China and Europe at the same time. And that combination could backfire.
It would open the door for Beijing to further divide the United States and Europe. This could end up in a situation where European countries seek to benefit from greater trade with China.
Okay, let's pull the pieces together. And on both the military and tariffs, Trump could use some help from allies.
As we heard, catching up with China's navy could be impossible without South Korea and Japan. And taking on China over trade would be much easier with Europe on side.
So can Trump go from America first to America plus friends? That could be a stretch for a man who's been such a skeptic of alliances for so long. We'll soon find out whether with challenges this big, he decides there are deals to be done this time around.
And for more, we can speak to Wyne. He's a senior research and advocacy advisor on the US and China at the International Crisis Group, and he's joining us now from Washington. Welcome to DW. Now, China has said that no one will win a trade war. Is that true? Does anyone stand to gain here?
Well, thank you for having me on your program. The president-elect seems to think that the United States will win. He, both during his first administration, since he's been out of office, and actually dating all the way back to the 1980s, Donald Trump believes that tariffs are a means of redressing economic imbalances. He believes that the benefits accrue to American consumers. But as you just said in your opening remarks, the overwhelming evidence suggests that when a country imposes tariffs, it's firms that are importing those goods that actually bear the costs, and those costs are very often passed to American consumers. We have empirical evidence from his first administration demonstrating that this trade war and that the tariffs didn't work. The costs were borne by companies and consumers. And I think it stands to reason that if the president-elect goes ahead with his pledge, that once again, American companies and consumers would bear the brunt of the costs.
Trump is saying that he will impose a 25% tariff on goods coming from Mexico and Canada, as well as an extra 10% on Chinese goods. What could the fallout be from these kinds of tariffs?
Very significant. And again, just turning to American companies and consumers, the three countries you mentioned, these are America's three largest trading partners. So the disruptions to continental supply chains, North American supply chains, global supply chains, the ramifications could be huge. And I think it's also notable that sort of in keeping with the president-elect's America First worldview, what's notable is China is a competitor, but if you look at Canada and Mexico, these are very significant, allies and partners. And so I think that per his America First worldview, he very often doesn't seem to make a distinction between U.S. allies and partners on the one hand and U.S. competitors and adversaries on the other. So I think that given that these three countries are America's three largest trading partners, the ramifications could potentially be very significant. And again, a failure to make a distinction between allies and partners on the one hand and competitors and adversaries on the other is, I think, a hallmark of the president-elect's worldview.
He said that one reason he's introducing new tariffs on China is to force a crackdown on the flow of drugs into the US, in particular fentanyl. Do you think that this will work? I mean, will fewer drugs now enter the US?
It's unclear, and I think it's difficult, especially unilaterally, when you impose these kinds of measures unilaterally. I think it's very difficult to sort of secure the kinds of concessions that you're looking to obtain. One rationale, or at least one hypothesis that some observers have posited, is that the president-elect is looking to use this pledge essentially as an opening gambit. He's looking to impose pressure, to put pressure on China, to put pressure on others, so that he doesn't actually have to go through with the full threat of what he has pledged. But again, what we've seen with these kinds of economic measures is when they're imposed unilaterally, they tend to be quite ineffective. So the more multilateral support you can engender or can enlist, the more effective they're likely to be. Just one other point that I would make is that, when Donald Trump was first elected president, he was a novelty not only for China, but for the entire world. China now has studied him and his worldview and his tactics now for 8 years. So this time, I think Donald Trump is going to confront a very different China, and a China that is prepared for this kind of tactic coming from the president-elect.
China's economy is in quite a vulnerable position right now, though, isn't it? So how will that factor in? I mean, how will China be able to react to all of this?
Well, they're two interesting dynamics, and they're somewhat in tension with one another. The first dynamic, or the first reality, which is the one that you mentioned, is that China's economy is indeed vulnerable right now. China is managing mounting growth headwinds on the one hand, so I think China certainly is more vulnerable to tariffs this time around than it was in say 2017, 2018, 2019. On the other hand, as I said earlier, China hasn't been sitting idly by. When the first Trump administration initiated its tariff campaign in 2018, it really set off alarm bells inside China. And China said that becoming less reliant on the dollar, becoming less exposed to U.S. economic pressure, it's not just an economic imperative, it is an existential, whole of society, national security imperative. So even though China's economy is more vulnerable now, I think relative to what it was several years ago, China has been, I think, taking several steps to insulate itself from economic pressure. So I think that in the aggregate, it's probably less vulnerable to economic pressure now than it was when the Trump administration initiated its first tranche of tariffs back in 2018.
Wyne from the International Crisis Group, thank you so much for your time today. We appreciate it.
Well, let's pick up some of those points with Stormy-Annika Mildner, who's Executive Director of the Aspen Institute, Germany. She's an expert on transatlantic relations and trade-related matters. Welcome to DW. What do you think? Is a trade war coming to America's friends and rivals?
Well, at least it's going to be rather conflictual. And why I'm saying this is because we have the experience from the first Trump administration, 2016 to 2020. And we also know about, and we just heard that also in the report, that he's just not a very great fan of trade. And that, on the other hand, he's a pretty big fan of tariffs. So he is, with regard to trade, he looks at trade balances. He looks at who has a trade surplus vis-a-vis the United States, in which products, in which sectors, and he views that as a sign for unfair trade practices. And we know from the first administration that he is not hesitant to implement tariffs to level the playing field. And he has already said that he's looking for a 10 to 20% base tariffs on all imports from the world.
OK. But the US already has a free trade deal with Canada and Mexico. Can Donald Trump just throw 25% at them like that?
Not easily, at least, but he can threaten with this. So in his first administration, he renegotiated NAFTA. So the previous agreement was called NAFTA. The current one is called USMCA. As we know from the Trump administration, and what he wants to do is he wants to connect different policy fields with each other. And he's using trade policy and the threat of tariffs to get something else. And in this case, he wants stricter border controls. He wants to contain illegal immigration. He wants to contain or address or fight drug smuggling and so on. And he wants to use USMCA for this. According to the agreement, he would not be allowed to put a 25% tariff on products coming from NAFTA, from the partner countries. And I'm pretty sure that they would also take this to the agreement's dispute settlement procedure. But he can threaten with this, and he can do it and then wait what's going to happen.
OK, so that's his opening shot. Just turning to China, we saw in our report the increasingly aggressive Chinese military posture and the country's improving production capacities. There have long been calls for more coordination between the US and the EU on foreign policy towards China. Do you think this Western alliance perhaps is running out of time?
Well, I would say that this is a policy area in which we are pretty sure that there will be a lot of continuity also from the Biden administration to the Trump administration. From the first administration, Trump administration, we know that there was a very aggressive trade policy vis-a-vis China with increasing tariffs, also to trade deals, a phase 1 and a phase 2 deal. And Biden did not go back on this, but continued this with also stricter export controls, investment screening, putting companies on the so-called entity list. So there's great unity. And for the EU, this is something we should reckon with. And over the last years, we were, or the Trump administration and the Biden administration, asked more of Europe to do and be more aggressive towards China with regard to unfair trade practices. And there are some things which the Biden administration was bugged about, and also the Trump administration is not going to like. And this is how the European countries reacted in a not very unified way with regard to subsidies, Chinese subsidies on Chinese e-vehicles, and the EU reaction with countervailing duties.
Right.
And Germany, for example, was one of the countries which did not vote for these tariffs.
It's going to be difficult, though, isn't it, for the United States to say to Europe, get behind us against China, when my recollection is in the first Trump presidency, there was a lot of the startings of a trade war between the US and the EU.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, we had a lot of conflicts, the steel and aluminum tariffs, for example, but also the threat of car tariffs. And it is difficult for the EU. And the EU now needs to think about how we are going to react to this. Are we also going to be more transactional and looking for deals? Do we want to prevent worse things from happening? Then we do also need to think about our own interests. Is it not also in our own interest to be tougher against China? These are all things which now need to be put into different scenario planning and different reactions. Or do we also want to be answering to the US tariffs with our own tariffs then? What is very clear, however, that this is going to be costly, and it's going to be more costly for us than for the US side, because we are very dependent on the US as an export market, a production market for our goods, for our companies. So for the EU, this is something we really need to think about.
OK. Thank you for taking us through that. Stormy-Annika Mildner from the Aspen Institute, Germany. Thank you so much.
Well, thanks for having me.